10 years earlier, Phil Lynott had stood on stage at Hammersmith Odeon, 20,000 fans screaming his name as Thin Lizzy tore through "The Boys Are Back in Town." The bass thundered through the speakers. His voice commanded the darkness. And for those few hours, he was invincible. A black Irish kid from Dublin who'd conquered the world with nothing but talent, charisma, and a refusal to be invisible. Now, in December 1985, he lay in intensive care at Salisbury Infirmary, his body a battlefield of failing organs. The only sound was the mechanical beep of monitors tracking a heartbeat that grew weaker with each passing hour. From sold-out arenas to a stark hospital room. From rock god to a 36-year-old man whose kidneys were shutting down, whose liver had surrendered, whose lungs struggled for each breath. The final 72 hours of Phil Lynott's life weren't dramatic. They were devastatingly quiet. And that silence told the real story of what heroin had stolen. But before we understand those final days, we need to go back. Back to a childhood that shaped everything. Back to the moments when the seeds of both greatness and destruction were planted in the same soil. Before we continue this journey, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the untold stories that shaped music history. Philip Paris Lynott arrived in this world on August 20th, 1949 in West Bromwich, England. His mother, Philomena, was Irish. His father, Cecil Paris, was from Guyana. In 1949 Britain, that combination was more than unusual. It was scandalous. Cecil disappeared before Phil could form memories of him, leaving Philomena to face the impossible task of raising a mixed-race child in an Ireland that wasn't ready for difference. By the time Phil was 4, Philomena had made an agonizing decision. She would send her son to Dublin, to be raised by her mother while she worked in England, sending money home when she could. It was an act of survival, not abandonment, but young Philip didn't understand the distinction. He only knew that his mother was gone, his father was gone, and he was different from every other child in Crumlin. The streets of 1950s Dublin were not kind to a black child. Chocolate drop, they called him. Darky. Worse things too. Words that cut deeper than fists. Phil learned to fight early. Had to. His grandmother Sarah tried to shield him, but she couldn't be everywhere. The schoolyard was a daily trial, the walk home an obstacle course of potential humiliation. But something else was happening in those brutal years. Phil was learning to transmute pain into power. When words failed him, and they often did, this shy boy with the striking looks, he found music. First it was listening to his grandmother's records. Then it was singing along. By his early teens he'd discovered rock and roll, and in the rebellion of Elvis and Little Richard he found a language that finally fit. The loneliness never left him, though. Even as he formed his first bands in the late 1960s, the Black Eagles, then Skid Row, then Orphanage, Phil carried the weight of being perpetually outside. Not quite Irish enough for Ireland. Not quite black enough for the black community. Too rock for traditional music. Too poetic for straightforward rock. In 1969, he co-founded Thin Lizzy with drummer Brian Downey and guitarist Eric Bell. The name itself was a statement of intent, derived from a comic book character, Thin Lizzy, but spelled with attitude. They were going to be different because Phil had never known how to be anything else. For 3 years, Thin Lizzy struggled. They played pubs that smelled of stale beer and disappointment. They recorded albums that critics liked but audiences ignored. Phil worked as a music journalist between gigs, writing reviews of other people's success while his own remained elusive. Then came 1972. The band decided to record Whiskey in the Jar, an old Irish folk song, but they weren't going to play it straight. Phil's arrangement transformed the traditional ballad into a hard rock anthem, his bass line driving like a heartbeat, his vocals adding a streetwise edge the song had never possessed. When it hit number 6 on the UK charts, everything changed overnight. Suddenly, the black kid from Crumlin was on top of the pops. The outsider was inside. But success brought new pressures, new demons, new ways to feel like he didn't belong. The hit should have solved everything. Instead, it introduced Phil to the very thing that would kill him 13 years later. Because with fame came access to parties where cocaine flowed like champagne, to a lifestyle where excess was expected, to substances that promised to fill the void that childhood had carved into his soul. By 1974, Thin Lizzy had evolved. Eric Bell was out, and in came the dual lead guitar attack of Scott Gorham and Brian Robertson. This was Phil's masterstroke, the two guitars weaving around each other like boxers, creating a sound that was both melodic and aggressive. It was the sound of conflict made beautiful, and it mirrored everything about Phil's internal life. The album Jailbreak dropped in 1976, and The Boys Are Back in Town became an anthem that still plays in bars across the world today. Phil had written it about some guys he used to know in Dublin, a simple story of friendship and Saturday nights, but something in the song's DNA made it universal. Everyone knew those boys. Everyone had been those boys. American tours followed, stadiums, money, more money than a kid from Crumlin had ever imagined, and with it the pharmaceutical buffet of 1970s rock and roll, cocaine to stay up, quaaludes to come down, alcohol to smooth the edges, and somewhere in there someone offered Phil heroin. He said yes. Nobody starts using heroin thinking they'll become addicted. Phil certainly didn't. He thought he was different, stronger, smarter. The drug was just a tool, he told himself, something to take the edge off the pressure, to quiet the voice that still whispered he didn't deserve any of this. But heroin doesn't care about your intelligence or your intentions. It only cares about taking everything. Phil met Caroline Crowther in 1977. She was the daughter of television personality Leslie Crowther, blonde and proper and everything Phil's chaotic life wasn't. They had chemistry that friends described as electric. When their daughter Sarah was born in 1978, Phil seemed for a moment to have found something that might save him. They married in 1980. Their second daughter, Kathleen, arrived the same year. Phil wrote love songs. He talked about settling down, but the road kept calling, and the heroin kept calling louder. Caroline tried. God, how she tried. But living with an addict is like living with a ghost. Sometimes they're present, sometimes they're just an outline of the person you fell in love with. The lies started small. I'm fine. I'm just tired. It's just the tour. Then they got bigger. Money disappeared. Phil would vanish for days. When he came home, his eyes were somewhere else. The marriage lasted 4 years on paper. In reality, it was over much sooner. Caroline took the girls and left, not out of anger, but out of survival. Phil, in his lucid moments, understood. In his addicted moments, he blamed everyone but himself and the drug. By 1983, everyone close to Phil knew he was in trouble. Gary Moore, his childhood friend and sometime Lizzy guitarist, had watched the decline with increasing horror. He'd staged interventions. He'd begged. He'd threatened. Nothing worked. Because here's what people don't understand about heroin addiction. By the time everyone else sees the problem, the addict has been drowning for years, and Phil Lynott was already underwater. The band limped through the early 1980s like a wounded animal. Guitarist changes became routine. Gary Moore in, Gary Moore out. John Sykes in, Snowy White for a spell. Each lineup brought hope, but Phil's addiction made consistency impossible. He'd miss rehearsals, show up late to gigs, forget lyrics on stage. In 1983, they played their farewell tour. The final show was both celebration and funeral. Fans who'd grown up with Whiskey in the Jar and The Boys Are Back in Town watched their hero barely hold it together. Phil's bass playing, once so tight, so driving, was sloppy. His voice, that magnificent instrument, was shot. After Lizzy officially dissolved, Phil tried to start again with a new band called Grand Slam. It should have been a fresh chapter. Instead, it was a sad epilogue. Gigs were sporadic. Record labels wouldn't sign them. Phil's reputation as an unreliable addict had spread through the industry like a stain. Phil had released solo albums, Solo in Soho in 1980 and the Philip Lynott album in 1982. There were moments of brilliance in both. Flashes of the old Phil. Yellow Pearl, created with Midge Ure, became the theme music for BBC's Top of the Pops. Millions heard it every week. Phil should have been riding high on that success. Instead, he was shooting heroin in squat bathrooms. The disconnect between his public success and private collapse had become a chasm. Friends would see him on television, that charismatic smile, that confident swagger, and then visit him at home to find a man who couldn't get off the couch, who'd pawned his own gold records for drug money. Christmas 1985 should have been about family. Phil's daughters Sarah and Kathleen were 7 and 5 years old. They should have been opening presents with their father, making memories. Instead, Phil was at his mother's house in Richmond, barely holding himself together. Philomena could see it. Her son was dying in front of her, but what could she do? He was 36 years old. You can't force a grown man to save himself. Philomena Lynott woke on December 25th to sounds of distress from Philip's room. When she opened the door, her son was on the floor, convulsing. His lips had turned blue. His eyes were rolling back. This wasn't the first overdose she'd witnessed, but somehow she knew this one was different. The ambulance seemed to take forever. Philomena rode with her son, holding his hand, whispering prayers she hadn't said since he was a child. At Salisbury Infirmary, doctors worked with the grim efficiency of people who'd seen this scenario too many times. Heroin overdose complicated by years of abuse, kidney failure, liver damage, sepsis setting in. The words blurred together. They stabilized him, but barely. Phil drifted in and out of consciousness over the next day. When he was lucid, he couldn't speak, tubes down his throat, machines breathing for him. Philomena sat by his bed, wondering how they'd ended up here. Her beautiful, talented, tortured son reduced to beeping machines and IV drips. Word spread quickly through the music community. Gary Moore dropped everything and drove to Salisbury. When he walked into that hospital room and saw Phil bloated yellow with jaundice, barely recognizable, Moore broke down. This was his best friend, his musical brother, and there was nothing left to say that hadn't been said 100 times before. Scott Gorham came. Brian Downey came. They stood awkwardly by the bed. These men who'd created magic together, now united only by helplessness. Phil's eyes would occasionally flutter open, and they'd see recognition there, but also resignation. He knew. They all knew. Caroline brought the girls on December 28th. It was a mercy visit, a chance for daughters to say goodbye to a father they'd barely known. Sarah, the older one, tried to be brave. Kathleen, only 5, didn't understand why everyone was crying. Phil couldn't hold them, couldn't speak, could only watch through drug-glazed eyes as his children, the best things he'd ever created, stood at the foot of his hospital bed like visitors to a museum. On January 3rd, Phil's condition deteriorated sharply. The sepsis had spread. His kidneys had stopped functioning entirely. Pneumonia had settled into his lungs. The doctors told Philomena what she already knew. There was nothing more they could do. It was just a matter of time. She stayed by his bed all night, holding his hand, talking to him about Dublin, about his childhood, about the time he'd first shown her his bass guitar and declared he was going to be famous. "You did it, love," she whispered. "You showed them all. You were magnificent." At 2 a.m. on January 4th, 1986, the monitors began their final alarm. Nurses rushed in, but it was protocol, not hope. Phil Lynott's heart stopped beating at 2:04 a.m. 36 years old, dead from complications of heroin addiction, dead from a disease he'd never admitted he had. Philomena sat with his body for an hour before she could bring herself to leave. Her son, her beautiful, complicated, self-destructive son, was finally at peace. The autopsy would reveal what everyone suspected. Years of drug abuse had destroyed Phil's internal organs. His liver was cirrhotic. His kidneys were barely functioning before the final overdose. Doctors estimated he had months to live, even if he'd never touched heroin again. But Phil never got those months. He got 72 hours in a hospital room, surrounded by people who loved him but couldn't save him. Phil Lynott's funeral in Dublin drew thousands. Fans lined the streets as the hearse passed, throwing roses, weeping openly. Inside St. Elizabeth's Church, the music community gathered, members of U2, the Boomtown Rats, virtually every Irish musician who mattered. Gary Moore played an instrumental tribute that left not a dry eye in the building. He was buried in St. Fintan's Cemetery. His mother insisted on an Irish funeral, bringing her son home to the country that had tormented him as a child but claimed him as a hero in death. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In 2005, Dublin unveiled a statue of Phil Lynott on Harry Street, just off Grafton Street. He stands larger than life, bronze bass guitar in hand, frozen in the moment before striking a chord. Tourists pose with it. Fans leave flowers and guitar picks at its base. But the statue's unveiling was controversial. Some of Phil's family members, including his mother initially, boycotted the ceremony. Their anger was legitimate. Dublin hadn't loved Phil when he was alive and vulnerable. The city had made his childhood hell, and now they wanted to profit from his memory, to turn his complicated legacy into a tourist attraction. Yet the statue stands, and maybe that's fitting. Phil Lynott was always a contradiction. Loved and lonely, celebrated and scorned, black and Irish, rock star and junkie. The statue captures him at his peak, forever young, forever talented, forever just about to play. Music critics sometimes play the game of what if. What if Phil Lynott had gotten clean? What albums would Thin Lizzy have made in the 1990s? How would Phil's songwriting have evolved? What collaborations might have happened? We'll never know. Heroin doesn't allow for second acts. It doesn't care about potential or talent or the people you leave behind. It only takes. Phil left behind 2 daughters who grew up without their father. He left behind a mother who spent the rest of her life advocating for addiction awareness, turning her grief into purpose. He left behind band members who still, decades later, struggle to talk about those final days without tears. But he also left behind Whiskey in the Jar and The Boys Are Back in Town. He left behind Dancing in the Moonlight and Emerald. He left behind proof that a mixed-race kid from Dublin could stand on stages and command the world's attention. He left behind evidence that you could turn pain into art, loneliness into poetry, difference into power. Phil Lynott died on January 4, 1986, but parts of him had been dying for years. dying every time he chose heroin over his daughters, his career, his life. The final 72 hours in Salisbury infirmary weren't the tragedy. They were just the ending to a tragedy that had been unfolding since the first time he felt like he didn't belong, the first time someone called him a name that made him feel less than human, the first time he used a substance to fill the void where acceptance should have been. Rock and roll didn't kill Phil Lynott. Racism didn't kill Phil Lynott. Addiction killed Phil Lynott. But all those other things fed the addiction, created the conditions where a drug could whisper lies that sounded like truth. You're not good enough, the world told him, but I can make you feel good enough, the heroin promised. In the end, both were lying. If you or someone you love is struggling with addiction, please reach out for help. Phil Lynott's story doesn't have to be everyone's story. There are resources, there are people who understand, there are paths out of the darkness. Don't wait for your own 72-hour countdown.